The Ogallala Aquifer cannot be refilled. Under 8 states, from Nebraska down through the Texas Panhandle, sits water that fell as rain thousands of years before the last mammoths died out on this continent. And once it's pumped from the ground, on any human timescale, it does not come back. Not in your lifetime, and not in your grandchildren's. The proof is written straight into the map itself. Draw one line across Nebraska. On one side, the ground stays full. Cross it heading south into Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Texas Panhandle, and that same rock holding that same ancient rain is already running out. Two completely different futures, decided by nothing more than which side of that line you happen to be standing on, and that line is about to explain almost everything about how the middle of this country changes next. This is the Ogallala Aquifer, though most of the people who farm on top of it just call it the water. It underlies about 174,000 square miles, roughly the size of California, buried in porous sand and rock under 8 states: South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. It is the largest aquifer in the country, and for about 70 years it has been quietly doing something almost nobody outside farm country stops to think about. It grows a fifth of the wheat, corn, cotton, and cattle feed produced in the United States. If you have eaten bread, a burger, or corn syrup in the last month, some of it likely grew on water pulled out of this ground in a state you may never have visited. The story of how that happened starts after the Second World War, with a wheel. Before then, this stretch of the Great Plains was short grass, wind, and dust, considered too dry to farm at any real scale. Homesteaders had already tried and failed here once. Then, in 1952, a Nebraska farmer named Frank Zybach patented something called center pivot irrigation. A long metal arm on wheels, anchored to a well, slowly rotating in a circle and watering everything underneath it as it goes. It looked almost too simple to matter. It changed the entire region. Before Zybach's design, the closest thing to it required a small army of ditches and siphon tubes, moved by hand, row by row, all season. His single arm on wheels did the same job without a single person standing in a field at 4 a.m. redirecting water by hand, and within a couple of decades, center pivots like his had spread across much of the region, sitting on top of this aquifer. Before the wheel, a farm out here lived or died on whatever rain showed up that year, and plenty of years nothing showed up at all. After it, a farmer could water the same amount of ground on the same schedule, regardless of what the sky decided to do. Fly over Nebraska or the Texas Panhandle today, and you can see the proof from the window seat. Thousands of perfect green circles stamped across land that used to be nothing but pale grass to the horizon. One circle per well, one well tapping the same ancient water table as the well next to it. Almost nobody explains this part before they get to the alarming headline. That water didn't spring from nowhere, and it isn't being replaced by this year's rain or next year's. Someone who studied geology back in the 1980s put it about as plainly as it can be put. What farmers were doing and are still doing today is called water mining, because it's fossil water. It was never going to be replenished by anything happening on the surface right now, this season, or this century. Some coverage of this aquifer has called what's happening here America's quiet disaster. Wrong word. A disaster is sudden, loud, and over in a day. This has been going on, unnoticed, for 70 years running. The same low-key decision, repeated by tens of thousands of individual wells, each one perfectly reasonable on its own, adding up to something nobody individually chose. So where did it come from, if not this year's rainstorms? Getting this next part right matters, because the wrong explanation makes the water sound almost renewable, and the right one doesn't. Most people's first guess is melted glacier, and that guess is wrong in a way that changes everything downstream of it. Ice sheets never reached this far south during the last ice age. The glaciers themselves stopped hundreds of miles north, up around the Great Lakes. What filled this aquifer over hundreds of thousands of years was ice age rainfall and mountain snowmelt draining east off the Rockies, carrying sand and silt down onto the plains and pooling underground in that porous rock, layer stacked on layer, for longer than human beings have had agriculture anywhere on Earth. That water has been sitting down there since before the last mammoths died out in North America, and today's rain barely touches it. A few places recharge measurably, mostly where sandy soil lets rain soak straight through. Most of the aquifer doesn't get that chance. Recharging versus not is the entire story of everything that happens next. There's a term hydrogeologists use for what happens around a well that's been pumped hard for decades: a cone of depression, a bowl-shaped dip in the water table that spreads outward from the well like a slow-motion sinkhole nobody can see from the surface. Pump one well hard enough for long enough, and that invisible bowl grows wide enough to reach the well next door, and then the one after that. Nobody plotted this on purpose. It's simply what happens when thousands of individual wells, each one perfectly legal, each one just watering one farm, all draw from the same finite bowl of ancient water at the same time. People disagree, loudly, about how old this water even is. Some peg it at tens of thousands of years. Others swear it's hundreds of millions. Neither number is the one hydrogeologists use for this system, and the confusion itself says something about how little most coverage bothers to explain the mechanism before rushing to the scary part. It formed over hundreds of thousands of years through repeated ice age cycles, not one single freeze. Now go back to that line across Nebraska, because this is where the map stops being an abstraction on a slide and starts being something you can stand on and see. In north-central Nebraska sits a region called the Sand Hills, rolling grass-covered dunes, more cattle country than cropland, sitting directly on top of the deepest, most saturated part of the entire aquifer. Under the Sand Hills, the water table sits close to the surface. The loose sandy soil acts almost like a giant sponge, and rain that falls gets a real chance to soak down and top the system back up before it evaporates or runs off. It's the healthiest patch of the Ogallala left anywhere. If this is the first time you've seen that split laid out on a map, subscribe, because we're doing this region by region for the whole country, and the divide only gets sharper the further south you follow it. Ranchers out here still talk about the water the way earlier generations did, as something you manage carefully but don't have to be afraid of. Cattle graze the dunes instead of center pivots carving them into circles, which is itself part of why this particular stretch of ground has stayed healthier than the cropland to its south. Less pumping, more natural recharge, and ground that never got plowed hard enough to lose its grass cover in the first place. The grass itself is doing real work here. Unbroken sod holds the dunes in place, and the same root systems that keep the sand hills from blowing away are what let rain soak down to the water table instead of running straight off into a ditch. Now follow that aquifer south, through Kansas, into Oklahoma, and down into the Texas Panhandle. The saturated thickness, the actual usable depth of water sitting in the rock, thins out dramatically, mile after mile. In parts of the Panhandle, decades of heavy irrigation pumping have pulled the water table down by well over 100 feet in some wells, and in the driest stretches, recharge from rainfall is close to zero. Same rock, same geology textbook chapter, and two futures that could not look less alike. The North holding on for generations to come, the South already running short within the lifetime of people alive on it right now. A landowner in Lee County, Texas, put a number on exactly what that looks like from the ground. After a municipal well field started pumping just 3 miles from his property, his own well dropped from 120 feet down to 250 feet. That's a family watching their water disappear on a government chart nobody outside the county will ever read because of someone else's straw sunk into the same shared aquifer a few miles up the road. And here is where the history loops back around and turns into a warning, because the ground underneath the Texas Panhandle and western Oklahoma has already lived through some version of this once before. In the 1930s, this same region was the epicenter of the Dust Bowl. Decades of native grass plowed under for wheat, followed by a brutal multi-year drought, stripped the topsoil bare and sent it airborne in storms dark enough to blot out the sun as far away as New York City. Families abandoned farms outright. The federal government eventually stood up an entire agency, the Soil Conservation Service, just to figure out how to keep American topsoil from blowing away again. It's one of the worst human-caused environmental disasters in American history, and it happened on the exact ground that center pivot irrigation later turned green again, decades afterward. The Ogallala didn't cause the Dust Bowl. The drought and the plow did that on their own. But the Ogallala is the entire reason that ground has stayed green since, the one variable that changed between then and now. Pull the water out from underneath it in the places where that water isn't coming back, and you are not looking at some far-off hypothetical. You're looking at slowly removing the one thing standing between that soil and a repeat performance. One top comment on this exact question summed up the unease in 2 words: Dust Bowl 2.0 476 people liked it, and that's real weight behind an honest question, not a fringe worry from one anxious viewer. So if you're watching this and you live out on the high plains, or your family does, here's a real question worth answering below, because nobody is tracking this at the scale it deserves. Has your own well dropped in the last 10 years? How many feet and where? That single number, multiplied across a few thousand comments from people who live on this ground, would map this crisis in more real-time detail than most official well surveys, which check a limited sample on a fixed yearly schedule. You'd be measuring thousands in real time for free. Before we get to why nobody is fixing this, if you're finding this useful, drop a like. It tells us to keep pulling these regions apart one at a time. This should make you angry, or at least deeply confused. Nobody is fighting hard to solve this, because the real obstacle is a plain set of incentives, and nobody with the power to change them particularly wants to touch it. In Texas, groundwater law runs on something called the rule of capture. In plain terms, whoever owns the land above the water generally has the right to pump whatever sits underneath it, with very little legal regard for the neighbor whose well runs dry as a direct result. Farmers and lawyers alike sometimes describe it, only half-jokingly, as the biggest well wins. That's the actual mechanism deciding who gets water and who doesn't, across a resource that ignores property lines completely and doesn't care whose name is on the deed. It's also not the only way to do this. Other states sharing this same aquifer lean on different rules, ones that at least ask whether a given use is reasonable or require some form of permit before a new well goes in. Texas inherited its rule from Old English common law, written centuries before anyone understood that groundwater under one farm connects to groundwater under the next. Texas courts have had several chances to update it and chose again and again not to. Texas, home to the deepest, driest stretch of panhandle decline, is also the state that places the fewest legal limits on pumping it dry. That's not a coincidence anyone planned. It's just what happens when the loosest rule sits directly on top of the thinnest water. Layer onto that a set of federal agricultural incentives, going back decades, that reward growing corn, much of which becomes ethanol for fuel or feed for cattle, using the kind of heavy irrigation that Ogallala was never built to sustain forever. It's the complaint people raise most, over and over whenever this topic comes up, and they aren't confused about the incentive. They're furious about it, and honestly, they have a case. Individually rational decisions, one farmer, one well, one growing season at a time, add up to a collectively irreversible outcome, and no single person in that chain has the power, or frankly much of an incentive, to be the one who stops first. There's a newer draw on this same water, and it earns exactly one honest sentence, because it is part of the story. Data centers, some of them built to run artificial intelligence, have started pulling from aquifers in this same region, including near Amarillo. That has been true for maybe 5 years. It doesn't explain why this aquifer has been declining for 70 straight years, and treating a 5-year-old headline as the villain lets the real decades-long story off the hook entirely. Fair enough to be uneasy about an industry built partly on cooling servers expanding into some of the hottest, driest ground in the country, on top of a water supply that was already stretched thin decades before the first server rack showed up. Just don't mistake it for the 70-year story. So, back to the question the comments keep asking over and over. What's the plan to restore it? The honest mechanism, stated plainly, on a human timescale, in the places where the aquifer runs thinnest, there is no plan to restore it, because restoring it was never a policy problem to begin with. It's a geology problem. The water that's gone from the Texas Panhandle took hundreds of thousands of years of ice age rain and mountain runoff to accumulate in that rock, drop by drop, storm by storm. Current rainfall across that same stretch of the Panhandle is a fraction of what would be needed to replace what a single irrigation season alone pumps out. You cannot conserve your way back to a water table that took that long to build in the first place. You can only slow how fast you lose whatever's left of it. That's exactly what parts of this region are doing right now, without much of a headline attached. Some water districts in Kansas have adopted mandatory pumping cutbacks on their own initiative. Some farmers have shifted whole fields over to dryland crops that need a fraction of the water alfalfa or corn demands, or simply let ground lie fallow on a rotation. Up in the Nebraska Sand Hills, where the aquifer runs thick and recharge is real, the strategy is almost the opposite. Protect what's already working, and don't let the Panhandle's mistakes creep north into healthier ground. ground. None of that reverses the depletion already locked in across the driest zones. It only decides how many more decades those places get before wells that are already failing become the rule out there instead of the exception. It's worth naming who carries that decision, because it isn't a distant agency. Nebraska splits authority for exactly this over a patchwork of locally elected natural resources districts, and Kansas runs its own set of groundwater management districts, each covering a different slice of the aquifer, each answerable to the farmers who live and vote inside its own boundary. It's about as close to direct local democracy as water management gets in this country, which is exactly why it's so hard to force a hard cutback on a neighbor you'll still be sitting next to at church on Sunday. These aren't distant bureaucrats in a state capital, they're elected board members who farm the same ground, sitting in a folding chair meeting room in a county courthouse, voting on rules that will shrink their own harvest before anyone else's. The people voting on these cutbacks are the same people whose income depends on the water being cut. That's the shape hiding inside this map. A slow motion divide, already visible today if you know where to look, between the part of this aquifer that still has time and the part that has already run out of it, sitting inside a legal and economic system that so far has given almost nobody a real reason to be the first one to slow down. If that Nebraska to Texas line means anything to you now, share this with someone who lives on either side of it. And if you've made it this far, you already know more about why your own part of the country looks the way it does than most of the people who scroll straight past the thumbnail. That's what this whole channel is built on. Every place you've ever lived in, driven through, or glanced at on a map got its shape from an actual reason, one you were probably never taught in school. Sometimes it's a river that decided to move overnight. Sometimes it's a fault line nobody can see from the road, quietly deciding where a city could and couldn't grow. This time, it's layer after layer of ancient rain and mountain snowmelt, stacked up under 8 states since before recorded history, running out faster in some places than others, and drawing one invisible line across the middle of the country that most of the people living directly on top of it have never seen drawn out loud. Until now. Next time you drive across Nebraska, Kansas, or the Texas Panhandle and pass one of those perfect green circles stamped into brown land, you'll know exactly what's underneath it, which side of that line you're standing on, and roughly how much longer that green has left. And somewhere under that same circle, a family is deciding right now whether their kids will be the ones still farming it or the ones who had to leave.